Black the Name by D.B. Halpert. Narrated by the author, D.B. Halpert. Chapter 19. Nightmare. Elizabeth tosses and turns on the small, slightly uncomfortable guest bed, but unable to wake herself from the sleep she quickly slipped into after laying down. She is thrust into a warping, twisting dreamscape that forms around her. Darkness all around, Elizabeth feels herself drifting in an endless expanse. But in the space around her, a familiar, imposing presence unsettles the feeling that to most would be relaxing. The presence intensifies when stones begin to fly at her from the void, all which come to a sudden stop, constructing a gray and black familiar wall. A cold stone floor manifests below her. Elizabeth's heart fills with worry, recognizing the construct of the cellar room that those who would call themselves her parents stored her in. Standing, Elizabeth runs to the last remaining opening, only to be stopped when a large wooden door slams into place, throwing her down and back into her cell. Not wanting to be imprisoned again, Elizabeth runs again to the wood of the door and begins to pound on it, the illusion of the dream becoming so visceral that she already forgets that she is asleep, when a gruff, deep voice moans from beyond the door. "Precious one, the masters desire that we need to return to your lessons." Recoiling from the door, Elizabeth's mouth responds, "No," but in terror is unable to speak. Pressing herself against the back wall, away from the door, Elizabeth feels powerless, a feeling that only grows as her form begins to wither, reducing down to an even younger body than was hers when she was a prisoner for her blood parents' cult. The nightgown Elizabeth laid to sleep in decays, falling from her shoulders into a pile of dust around her, and in the same moment, the snap of cold metal clasps, locking around her ankles, wrists, and neck, drops her to her knees, with the horrors rebuilding themselves around her. Feeling powerless, Elizabeth returns to her sleeping corner, and curling into a defenseless ball, she tries to sleep with the chill of being unclothed against the moist stone floor that makes rest impossible. Minutes or hours pass. Without a source of light, Elizabeth shivers on the ground, unable to tell the time that passes as she begs for the reprieve of sleep that does not come. A piercing shiver shoots through the young Elizabeth's spine when the door unexpectedly squeaks open and a terrifyingly familiar voice rolls into the room. "Child, it is time for your session. Rise." The man who would call himself Elizabeth's father stands in the door, imposing over the young girl, who is in the body she possessed when she was only 6 years old, who obediently rises to her feet, raising her arms in front of her instinctively. Elizabeth waits for the chains. From behind the black silhouette, 2 figures return to the room and attach chains to Elizabeth's bindings. Turning from the door, the man steps down the hall beyond. Following the gesture, the lackeys give a tug, ushering the defeated Elizabeth to follow in step. The hall is dimly lit, and the stone floor scrapes Elizabeth's feet raw as the robed individuals lead the naked child through the foreboding enclosed complex. The end of the hall opens through a large wooden door into a room painfully familiar to Elizabeth's mind, standing beside a slanted table with a wooden cylinder at both the head and the feet of the device. The woman, who would call herself Elizabeth's mother, greets the group with a tilted smile. My husband, my child, shall we begin today's attempt at evoking our Lord's connection to this world? Of course, my dear. Daughter, please take your place. The man responds, gesturing for the young girl to step to this slanted table. A passenger in her own body in this nightmare sequence, Elizabeth wants to take control, to use the abilities she has learned adventuring with Pearl, Aldrin, and Auburn, but she can't. The cold 6-year-old, ever-obedient steps chained to the table's sides before climbing up and laying on her back, extending her arms above her. The two robed figures holding Elizabeth's chains join her to the table, drawing the metal slack around the upper and lowered cylinders, pulling the child's arms and legs taut against the wood, locking the chains into place. On the crank cylinders, the two underlings bow their way out of the room. Stepping from the table, the woman returns with a pot of bubbling black dyed wax. Setting the pot on a stool next to the table, the woman stirs the hot liquid with a tarnished silver aspergillium, saying to the restrained child, You understand, darling, that we must do this to you for our Dark Lord, as it is through your suffering of flesh that will solidify your connection with him, and through that you shall become the bridge for which he can cross from his prison to our existence. Elizabeth's expression remains cold and still, and she stays silent in the anguishing anticipation for the session of ritual meant to draw the dark power from within her. The man lingers by Elizabeth, drawing a sharpened nail tip finger down the side of her face, saying, You are such a precious thing to us, so it would be appreciated if you would stop holding back your power. Darling, let us begin, the woman says, pulling the wax wand up to allow a viscous drizzle to show the mixture beginning to cool and thicken. Of course, my dear, the man responds, stepping to a crank connected to the two cylinders, prepared to twist it to stretch the young girl's limbs. With both in agreement to begin the torturous process of trying to draw Elizabeth's power out through the young girl's suffering, the two adults slowly and methodically begin discordantly chanting in unison. Migok kahai yah uayog ot finioli gari soth tarakatarasi balista ot fastnis wegot tlak tara beshtar ot iliug shog uanith ot sipan draktor amnigrift erat naiga afn ot krasn soth nor oger et der ruelar ot otermast ngaft neog ot bionede. Drawing the aspergillum from the wax, the woman begins to drizzle the boiling hot paste mixture onto and around Elizabeth in symbols very similar to the ones Elizabeth's magic forms when she gives herself over to the dark power within her. The woman first draws symbols around the restrained child on the wood of the table, with the first symbol drawn, with the hot wax traced softly over the child's stomach. Elizabeth feels control again as the wax sends a burning pain through her. Terror strikes her face. She begins to struggle against the chains. Looking down at her stomach, Elizabeth watches and feels something within restlessly beginning to churn. From the outside, Elizabeth's abdomen looks to bubble unnaturally, like the surface of boiling water being without the bubbles being allowed to pop. Both pain and intense nausea pulse through the young girl, with each bubble amplifying a feeling of her insides twisting and blending together. With a creepy glare, the man slowly waves his head from side to side and begins to turn the crank next to the table. The chains tighten again and begin to pull as the chant continues. Elizabeth feels her joints popping as the strain is put on her, and she is made unable to struggle. Under her skin, Elizabeth feels the bubbling mass of fluids in her stomach begin to squeeze like a paste running out to her appendages, coating the insides of her skin, her muscles, her bones in a thin, creamy layer. The woman traces along Elizabeth's limbs with the hot wax, causing the oozing beneath Elizabeth's skin to feel cold in comparison. With her nausea and pain reaching their peak, Elizabeth can't help but cringe for a moment before the sensation of the fluid passing under the surface of her flesh reaches her hands and feet. The man begins to turn the wheel more. One rotation followed by another. The chains tighten, strain against the wood of the table, and turning cylinders send a tearing pain through the young Elizabeth, with not only the feeling of her limbs becoming disjointed, but also the sensation of her skin sliding across her muscles and her muscles across her bones, all threatening to rip free from each other with the pulling stress. The man stops to hold the chains, pulling on Elizabeth's limbs. The child writhes with the pain, her back arching in a futile attempt to extend her reach as the woman continues to lay wax that burns the uppermost layers of Elizabeth's flesh. In a moment just before the point she would normally pass out from the pain and the ritual, instead, Elizabeth feels relief. The gurgling in the child's stomach intensifies in the moments after the woman pulls back, her inscription on the child complete. Admiring her glyph work as the chant continues, the visible bubbling of the child's stomach grows in curiosity and pulses with the feeling of fluid from her stomach squeeze out to her extremities. The chains go slack, causing the man to, in a panic, turn the wheel once more. But with each crank, he does not find the resistance of the chain become taut. The woman, continuing her chant, clasps her hands together in joy, watching the hardened wax on the young girl crack and separate. Elizabeth grows, her body stretching unnaturally until it can touch both ends of the table. The burning persists throughout her body, but shifts from a pain of boiling flesh to one of overexerted muscles, as the extended position begins to feel to her more like stretching than her being stretched. The chant continues to rhythmically roll from the mouths of the adults, who seem to praise the child's transformation, clasping their hands together and bowing while the girl twists, bowing while the girl twists on the table uncomfortably. A shift in the feeling of fluid draws from Elizabeth's appendages to her chest, forming a pressure weight that sits on her, making it hard to breathe. The girl's muscles spasm, sending a visible wave up from her abdomen, causing her to heave and retch in a desperate attempt to vomit in hopes of removing the forming mass of fluid, making it nearly impossible for her to breathe. Lighthead, after nearly a minute of gasping for air, Elizabeth feels a sharp pain in her stomach and suddenly is able to breathe again. Looking down to the pain, Elizabeth sees in her horror her abdomen torn open, horizontally revealing fully functional mouth with rows of sharp pointed teeth with long piercing canines triple the length of the teeth around them. A pain in Elizabeth grows, forcing her head forward, the strange transformation not ceasing. With a sudden crack, Elizabeth feels her head break from her spinal cord and shift to rest on top of her chest amongst the still present pulsing viscous fluidic pressure, sinking into the feeling of fluid pressing down on her chest. Elizabeth's head all but disappears, while at the same time making her torso look like a huge, bald, misshapen head with appendages reaching out from its tops and bottom. Compressing upon itself, the head that was once Elizabeth's body begins to float, suddenly becoming very similar in shape as a larger version of Boop. Pushing telekinetically from the table, the appendages strain against the chain restraints, causing Elizabeth to scream in a voice still somehow distinctly her own. In that same moment, Elizabeth's eyes begin to push together. Her body, acting like clay, seems like it is being molded by an invisible entity, bending unnaturally with the strain. In a split moment, Elizabeth knows her body cannot be compressed any further. She calls out for it to stop, but the two mad individuals remain where they are, looking upon the suffering of the child, chanting. A pain much more visceral than everything she has experienced thus far shoots through Elizabeth, as again, unable to breathe, the pressure on her chest grows even further, and she feels the tearing of the flesh on her back. It bursts that In a burst that sprays blood across the walls behind her, Elizabeth's head shoots up from the pillow, releasing a panicked gasp as her skeletal wings force themselves free, only to get stopped by the spanning outward by the confines of the room's walls, awkwardly folding upon themselves uncomfortably. Leaning forward to breathe heavily, feeling as though she is only just being able to breathe for the first time in hours, Elizabeth doesn't notice the tight, straining small fit of her nightgown. As she pulls the mangled sheets to the side so that she can stand, wanting to confront Alfredo about the nightmare she just experienced, blaming him and his potion for it, mind in a haze from the night terror and dripping in a cold sweat, Elizabeth doesn't notice, as she stands from the bed, the immense extended span of her wings to the nearly four times the size they had been when she met Pearl, uncomfortably pressing against the walls of the room that is far too small for them. Standing makes Elizabeth dizzy, and a searing soreness throughout her body makes her not notice her eye level reaching higher on the door frame than before she fell asleep. Even as she falls against it, unable to fully control her movements, also unaware that her nightgown, now looser as she stands so that it can drape freely over her, only barely covers a portion of her hips where once it had hung to her knees. Stumbling to Alfredo's desk at the back of the shop, in the dark, where even her heightened ability to see in the lightless environments has become blurry, Elizabeth doesn't feel her hair draping down longer than the nightgown to the back of her thighs, or that her wings still feel confined even in the larger area of the shop. Reaching the desk and barely able to hold herself up, Elizabeth sways in the light of the candle behind Alfredo, who is diligently at work mixing ingredients into a beaker in a very particular order, and she doesn't notice the change in the size of her canines or the new sharpness that has become all of her teeth as she goes to confront the alchemist. Everything goes black, and Elizabeth falls to the floor. When she comes to, Elizabeth is in a quaint, simplistically furnished room, with Alfredo's brown robe draped over her shoulders. Her wings having retracted back into her while she was unconscious. In the moment, she stirs, causing Alfredo to stand from a chair and taking a knee next to her. He offers Elizabeth a test tube of strange, creamy liquid and a glass of water, saying, "Here, take this. You were extremely dehydrated, and your blood sugar was so low it was nearly non-existent. Drink slowly." Her large, pale eyes flickering open to Alfredo, and Elizabeth takes the test tube and the cup of water, bringing one hand to her head with it pounding from a sudden headache, and she asks, "What happened?" "You came to me while I was working. You seemed flustered and had an enormous black skeletal wings protruding from your back, knocking most of my shop over in your wake. Did you possess the ability to extend and retract skeletal wings from into your back, with them breaking down in a way that they are not visible in the slightest while they are within you? Or is that a side effect I should note about the elixir?" "No, I had those before. I probably should have told you before. I don't know what I am, but I have come to think that I am not exactly human." "I know. I discovered as much from a hair you unknowingly left the first time you visited my shop. Please, what else are you experiencing as noticeable side effects? Nausea? Dizziness? We know about fainting." "Yes and yes. I could barely stand when I woke from a terrifying nightmare that I think had something to do with the potion. It focused on a strange feeling in my stomach that pushed a weird fluid feeling out through my body, coalescing in my chest, which made it very difficult to breathe." "Nightmares, Could have been." Alfredo responds, trailing off into a silent train of thought. "But I don't think the potion had any other effects, unfortunately." "I wouldn't say that the elixir appeared to me to have a very strong effect on your physical appearance." "What do you mean?" "When you collapsed, the first thing that I noticed was that you developed. In the short time it had been since you went for your night's rest, in many ways that people would describe as generously feminine. And I can personally say that you were not so young. I would find, and I can personally say that if you were not so young, I would find myself greatly attracted to you physically." "I don't feel any different." Standing, Alfredo offers his hand to Elizabeth, raising her to her feet, uttering, "Easy does it. Don't overexert," before gently leading her through the room to a full body mirror. Still not seeing any difference in her own height, Elizabeth looks inquisitively at the mirror, seeing herself draped in the large, baggy robe. Interested to see what Alfredo was referring to, Elizabeth slowly removes the brown fabric from her shoulders, letting the robe to drop to the ground around her feet. Before the garment even settles on the floor, Elizabeth gasps at her reflection, releasing in a whispered exclamation while she twirls in place happily. "Oh my gosh, I'm beautiful." Lifting a side of her nightgown, Elizabeth runs her other hand down the contours of her exceptionally slender waist out to her hips that widened in process of her body medicinally developing and letting the gown fall once more to her slender frame, covering her even thinner waist. She places her hands firmly to her chest, plump, soft, round. The flesh found is more than can be held with each hand, and Elizabeth gives herself a devilish smile in the mirror, knowing immediately that she has a fuller chest than Pearl, and filled with a pride in herself and her body for that fact. Turning to Alfredo, who subverts his gaze to the flicker of the fire, Elizabeth asks, filled with a love of her new appearance and lust for more, how long would it take to get another one of those potions? Startled by the question, Alfredo turns to Elizabeth, immediately throwing his hands in front of his eyes, having forgotten for that split instant why he was looking away. Another? Are you serious? Noticing Alfredo's discomfort, Elizabeth lifts the baggy brown robe back over her shoulders and, stepping to him, grabs the arm blocking his hand, pulls it away so that he can see the seriousness in her eyes before she responds. Deftly. A couple of days, maybe a week. I have to get the materials, and they aren't easy to come by. Jumping up and down, showing her true age, Elizabeth cheers. Yay! Pearl and I will be here for about a week. We can test a potion or two more for you in that time. You can make me another one of those. Go get some more sleep. You shouldn't be experiencing any further effects, and they should be very minor, if any. Alfredo explains, pushing Elizabeth to the room's door. Stepping through, Elizabeth turns to Alfredo and, giving him an unexpected hug, exclaims, Thank you, Mr. Alfredo, before releasing an unintelligible squeal of excitement and running through the shop back to the guest room, where she finds Pearl in a wet outfit laying in a puddle at the side of the room opposite the bed. Elizabeth tries to lay down and return to sleep, but the excitement and want to show off to Pearl and Aldrin, and the hope that now Auburn may not see her as a complete monster, prevents her from remaining still. Instead, she spends the night dancing with herself, filled with the joy only a young person can feel when they believe everything happening to them is positive.